So when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to study in grad school, a former professor of mine asked me if I had ever heard about the Mitford sisters. I hadn't. So I looked them up, and as soon as I saw that one of the sisters was named Unity Valkyrie, and she was born in a town called Swastika in Ontario, and she became a Nazi, I was pretty much hooked. Her sisters, Nancy, Pamela, Diana, Jessica, and Deborah, having all been raised in the same household with the same parents, all made very different choices and supported very different political ideologies, and they all absolutely fascinated me. The Mitfords were the opening to my growing interest in Britain's aristocracy and upper class, a group of people who lived lives that were completely foreign to me. As I read more about these people that lived within this privileged class, my interest in their responses to the new post-First World War society also grew. Once I began my graduate studies, I honed my research, choosing to focus on the political options that the British, but specifically the aristocracy, were afforded during the interwar period. One of the Mitford sisters, Diana, had been married to the founder of the British Union of Fascists, which is a political party I'd never heard of before. And another one, Jessica, was affiliated unofficially with the Communist Party of Great Britain. So I was curious as to why these new political parties were so unsuccessful within Great Britain, while their parallel counterparts on the European continent were so successful. Through further research, it became clear that although there was a vast collection of scholarship on the aristocracy and upper class during the interwar period, as well as on the new political ideologies of the same era, there was a lack of research discussing their relationship to each other. My thesis adds a new element to the historiography of the interwar period as it explores what motivated members of the upper class to support the radical political ideologies of communism and fascism during the interwar period. It offers a new look at three heavily researched areas: the interwar period, the aristocracy, and radical politics, and explores how the three affected each other in various ways that eventually led to a drastically altered political, economic, and social structure in the second half of the 20th century in Great Britain. My research examines the thematic reasons behind why members of the aristocracy and upper class in Britain supported communism and fascism during the interwar period. I chose to divide the individuals I researched into two groups, the pre-1900 generation and the post-1900 generation. While both groups were raised with similar traditions that were found within their class for generations, their varying perspectives dictated by the First World War caused them to respond to events that threatened their traditions and, in a way, their entire existence in very different ways. These opposing views caused the pre-1900 generation to swing to the right politically, while the post-1900 generation swung to the far left. While their reasons for rejecting mainstream politics were nearly identical, their support of the far left or far right was dictated by their experiences with the First World War. The pre-1900 generation of the upper class attempted to hold on to their pre-war status and power by supporting fascism and its tenets of authoritarian rule, strict class division, and social regeneration through uber-nationalism. While fascism was a populist movement, it appealed to many in the upper class who saw it as a way to recreate their experiences they had as soldiers in the First World War and to extend their political power where mainstream parties had failed them. Meanwhile, the post-1900 generation rebelled against their elders and used communist ideology centered on an equality utopia to create a new political, economic, and social balance in the post-war era. For many, their rebellion took on the form of first adhering to pacifism in the aftermath of the First World War, which for most led directly to communist ideology. Although the two generations aligned themselves with vastly different radical politics, their reasons for supporting these ideologies were the same. Both generations abandoned traditional politics and used their new belief systems to either restore or reject the past. The pre-1900 generation saw the interwar period as a time for rebuilding and reestablishing themselves as the ruling class. When change through mainstream politics was seen as too slow, fascism became the vessel to bring about rapid change, following the examples in Germany and in Italy. The post-1900 generation saw this time as ripe for fundamental change, and the means to accomplish this was through communism, a new political and economic system that was diametrically opposed to the traditional upper-class values they'd been raised with. I argue that although these groups supported radically different political ideologies, the thematic reasons why they broke from their traditions are virtually identical. They are the following: disillusionment with post-war politics and economics, poor familial relationships and the pressures of ancestry, frustrations with the traditional public school upbringing, which included mandatory participation in the officers' training corps, and personal egotism. Unstable political leadership and an uncertain economic future during the interwar period concerned both generations. The older generation supported fascism after seeing positive improvements it garnered in Germany and Italy, while the younger generation, who rebelled against their parents by taking up residence with and befriending those in the lower classes in both England and on the continent, embraced societal change through communist principles. Both generations also reacted differently to the pressures brought about by tradition and ancestry. The older generation attempted to fit these traditions into a changing society and sought to reestablish power through the fascist tenet of social regeneration and restoration of the aristocracy. Meanwhile, the younger generation rejected their traditions by embracing communism with its antithetical to upper-class norms belief system. The rejection of mainstream politics also stemmed from experiences at public school and the officers' training corps. Fascism and its emphasis on tight bands of supporters was a way for the older generation to retain the camaraderie and support systems they'd received in the OTC, and for many in military service. The younger class, attending school in the OTC during and slightly after the horrors of the First World War, found it difficult to reconcile participation in a program of military training that would only serve to involve them in another world war. They rejected the values promulgated by the OTC in military service and affiliated themselves with pacifism. And it was through pacifism that most found their way to communism, as both systems sought to create new societies without exploitation. My research becomes a case study of not only why sons and daughters of baronets, lords, and landowners who grew up to be politicians, writers, activists, and career military officers supported non-traditional parties on opposite ends of the political spectrum, but also why they returned to the traditions of patriotism and main party lines with the onset of the Second World War. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, and neither the Communist Party of Great Britain nor the British Union of Fascists had succeeded in enacting any lasting change in Great Britain, a more traditional version of patriotism trumped radical politics, and likewise its followers returned to a more traditional support of their country. Patriotism was not dead in the interwar period. It was, however, embodied by these radical supporters in a skewed manner. Through their politics, writings, and rebellions, both generations of radical supporters attempted to make Britain stronger and more united, but did so in a non-traditional and ultimately unsuccessful way. Just as Great Britain as a whole attempted to regain its metaphorical footing in the aftermath of the First World War, the British aristocracy and upper class struggled to retain their place within society. Their support of radical politics during this time is a manifestation of their struggle. Those that supported radical politics had no idea that another expensive and expansive war in 20 years' time was on the horizon, but after the Second World War, most realized that radical politics were clearly not the solution. This permanently altered the aristocracy after 1945. Although the aristocracy and upper class once again found itself facing a deeply changed society, as they had during the interwar period, a resurgence of radical politics did not recur. Hitler and Mussolini's defeat in the Second World War meant that fascism was dead, and Stalin's new policies dictated a communist ideology that differed very heavily from the policies disseminated by both the Comintern and the Communist Party of Great Britain a decade before. As the second half of the 20th century began, the aristocracy and upper class attempted to enact change through mainstream avenues, having now seen the failure of extreme politics during the interwar period, both at home and on the continent. Ultimately, they found themselves adapting their traditions to fit a changing world, instead of altering their world to fit their long-standing traditions, as the latter had obviously been a failure during the interwar period. This research opens the door for future research into the connection between the aristocracy and radical politics during the interwar period. One further strand of inquiry is delving deeper into the differences and similarities and the reasons why upper-class men and women supported radical politics, especially since their traditional roles within their society and class were very different. Another is the differentiation between the members of the upper class whose titles were newly appointed, with those families whose generational lines were more firmly established, and interpreting whether or not their support of radical politics was the same. My research is just the first step in adding to the already present scholarship by providing a new perspective into the relationship between a long-standing social and political class with the new and short-lived radical political ideologies of the time period. Thank you. Any questions? All right, thanks.
Are there any examples today of upper rich class people that are in radical politics that could use as a parallel in terms of one time period and another?
Not as much, mostly because the upper class in Britain is so incredibly diminished now. It's a lot smaller than it's essentially ever been. And they tend to kind of still fall along the old traditional party lines. The interwar period was almost kind of an aberration, where they tried something different, it didn't work out, and they realized they couldn't go back to it because the result was a second world war, which no one wanted to see again. No one wants a third world war. So you have a fairly small upper class right now, and you also have an upper class where some of these kind of arbitrarily given titles have now been removed. So you have a far smaller House of Lords than you did beforehand. So they're a small class who still has the titles, but really don't have the power that they've had in the past.
Can I ask one question about the interwar period then? In terms of the upper class, were there any examples within like the royal family itself that were maybe started on as pacifists or something like that thought this was potentially a way of grappling with what was going on in that time period, but that you just don't hear about? Or
within the upper class, there has been, especially at this time, where you have kind of the Edward versus George debate of would you rather have Edward as king during the war or George? Although there were German sympathies with Edward during the interwar period, especially as he began his relationship with Wallace Simpson and had the whole abdication crisis. Most scholars don't believe that he would have sided with Hitler. A lot is kind of speculation that that is what would have happened, that, oh, thank goodness that King George was king when Britain went to war, because otherwise we would have been on the side of the Germans. His sympathies for Germany never would have, or at least most scholars say never would have trumped his role as king. His loyalties ultimately would have lied with Great Britain at the time. But there were definitely sympathies that happened, and that was kind of very similar to the sympathies that you were seeing within the upper class as a whole.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yes.
So you said that pacifism led to communism?
For a lot of the young communists that were part of the upper class.
The global model for communism at the time was the Bolsheviks, wasn't it? They were hardly a peaceful group.
Right. For the Communist Party of Great Britain, and I didn't really have time to get into it, but I discuss it within my thesis itself, the Communist Party of Great Britain was always kind of a struggling party. They were originally formed when the Comintern basically created these different models within different European countries. But in Great Britain, for most of them, the policies that happened there were constantly changing because they were always at a really low membership number. And so they were constantly changing the policies. They were changing the way that they were doing recruitment. Eventually, they joined with the Independent Labor Party and with other kind of socialistic type parties in order to increase their membership. So while pacifist ideology doesn't necessarily align with communist ideology, for many of the people that I look at, they didn't wake up one morning and say, well, I'm a communist. Many of them were fighting back against this idea of, we don't want to be part of an officers training corps. We don't want to fight. We are pacifists. We're not going to step into this role that our parents want us to be as officers, to go to Sandhurst, to go fight, to be these types of leaders. So they start being pacifists, and for many of them, their pacifism eventually leads them to a more extreme version of rebellion, which for them was communism. Any other questions?